Moonlight lanced the canyon like a knife through skin, the river a shimmering scar that bled silver across the stone. Vultures traced slow, black prayers against the stars, while the wind carried the breath of mesquite and old gunpowder. A bay horse snorted on the rimrock, as if it could smell the bruise forming on the night itself. Before we begin this journey, if you carry a little dust in your lungs and a little fire in your chest, subscribe, share, and stay with me at the edge of this frontier, because what comes next will lean over your shoulder and whisper to your bones. She stood waist deep in the cold, the water clinging like a second skin, the world around her still as a held breath. The camp was a distant smudge of smoke and murmurs, her people folded into the dark the way antelope fold into grass. She had come to the river for quiet, for a moment where the sky was only sky and not a ceiling pressing down. Her name was Naya, and endurance had been braided into her life since the first time she could string a bow. The canyon quickly learned the shape of her silence. Then laughter tore it open. It skipped along the water and pelted the stone like thrown gravel, and shadows broke from the brush with that laugh sharpened into theft. Hands that were not her people's hands snatched what she had set aside. Boot heels bit the sand, faces twisted with the joy of meanness. And they were gone, leaving ripples and a hush that wasn't peace at all but the shock that follows a slap. She bowed into herself, not to hide but to hold. The humiliation had teeth. It bit deeper than the bite of winter river. No blood, and yet it bled. She would not chase them with nothing but water on her skin and anger in her fists. She pressed her forearms across her chest and breathed like a hawk struck by buckshot, careful, furious, alive. The canyon had witnessed hunger and raids and the steady grind of newcomers who mistook dirt for destiny. It had never seen Naya cry. It did not see her cry now. Hoofbeats entered the quiet, slow and patient, like a god testing the earth before planting a storm. A rider came down the bank, hat brim low, belt heavy, coat folded in one hand like a small shelter. He did not fill the silence with words. He filled it the way a rock fills a river, by being exactly what it is. He turned his gaze aside while he offered what someone else had stolen, and Naya took the rough shield into her arms like a treaty issued by the cold itself. The coat was a map of dust and sweat and the years of a hard trail. She wrapped it over shoulders still trembling with rage. The trembling didn't shame her. It was the price paid by muscles that had refused to bend. They rode, not because rescue was a cure, but because justice is a road, and sometimes two riders make the dust rise twice as high. The tracks stitched a loud story across the sand, careless men who believed nothing on this earth could answer them. The river untied itself behind Naya and Colton as they pushed into the narrows, the cliffs leaning close to hear what came next. Firelight scraped the rock, bottles winked like lizard eyes. The thieves sprawled beside their arrogance. Naya and the cowboy peeled off their saddles in a single silent decision and walked forward with the plain weight of consequence at their backs. Rifles lay on the ground the way snakes sleep before lightning wakes them. A garment waved in a hand that meant to mock. The mocker's mouth stilled when justice arrived with bootsteps. Naya took back what was hers. The hands that trembled then were the hands of triumph, not fear. And when she rose, the canyon adjusted its spine to make room for the shape she now carved into it. They left the campfire to collapse into its own ash. They rode until dawn unrolled like a gauze bandage around the raw night. Her people watched from the edge of their fires as Naya returned wrapped in a stranger's coat and her own unbroken gaze. They did not ask how she had reclaimed what had been taken. It was enough to see that she had. The cowboy kept a distance with the same precision he carried his revolver, as if space itself was something he had learned to aim. Morning hauled light over the ridges and revealed the first mark of the day on the dust, a set of prints not stamped by the 3 men they had faced by the fire. Smaller, barefoot, a child's. The trail cut across the thieves' boot marks and went north where the canyon flared open into a basin dotted with juniper the color of old money. Naya reined in and studied the earth with a hunter's patience. The prints doubled back, weaving, as if the child had been chased and had learned too early the art of confusion. She looked at the cowboy without a word, and he answered by turning his horse toward the north. 2 trails had been laid in front of them, one stamped with greed, the other with fear. They chose the latter, not because grief asked them to, but because decency did. The basin led to a ghost town whose false fronts still braced themselves for commerce that would never come. Windows gaped like missing teeth. A bell slept in a beltree that had forgotten its tongue. The prince ran through the empty main street and up to a building whose planks whispered about sermons and gunfights in equal measure. Naya slid from the saddle and went in first. Dust swam in shafts of light like minnows in a shallow creek. On the floor, a little boy lay curled under the last pew, his breath a small, hard flutter. Rope marked his wrists in a language Naya understood too well. She knelt and put her hands where they could be seen. The boy flinched at first, then stilled with the edge of death instinct that recognizes gentleness as a kind of weapon in its own right. A scrap of paper lay near his feet with letters scratched by a knife tip. Naya did not learn the white men's writing by choice but by necessity. She read the slant and the angles and heard the hiss of meaning rise from them. A name carved in hate, a place to deliver what had been taken, a small bounty promised by a larger cruelty. The thieves had not acted for sport alone. They had baited a net strung much wider than a canyon, and the name inked into the thin paper was not a random target, but a brand burned into the history of Naya's people. The boy's eyes opened. They were the color of a stormy river before noon. He did not speak. He pressed his cheek against the splintered wood and trembled in a rhythm Naya could translate. Hunger, exhaustion, the tail end of terror. Her anger cooled into purpose at a temperature that could still crack a stone. The cowboy cut the rope with a knife smoothed by long sharpening. His hands were careful the way a surgeon's must be, though his nails told stories about grit and rains and dirt that had become a second skin. He lifted the boy with a kind of respect often reserved for flags and the dead. They made a camp in the skeleton of a livery stable, where swallows had drawn their own blueprints in mud. Naya built a fire that was more ember than flame. Smoke licks told the sky the smallest possible story. The boy drank water and fell into sleep that bit him with old wolf teeth called dreams. Naya and the cowboy watched the sun slick down the farm mesa like oil. Silence sat between them the way truth often does, weighty, unadorned, impossible to look away from. The coat now hung on a nail. The wind moved through it, testing seams. In its lining, a piece of stitching had pulled away, a seam split by years. Fabric gaped enough for Naya's eye to catch a corner of paper tucked like a secret carried long enough to become a part of the body that bore it. She eased the lining back and slid out what lay inside. The paper was thin and brittle with the age sweat gives to anything that presses against it. It carried more of the white men's script, sharper than that carved note, precise in the way maps are precise and orders are precise. The seal stamped in the corner was iron red and official. Naya had seen such seals on treaties that were honored only long enough for a signature to dry. Her throat tightened around air that was suddenly harder to swallow. The paper wasn't some personal wish or a lover's letter. It was a directive. A name marched down the line like soldiers on review. It was her name. She read twice to be sure the words were not a fever. Her name, and the bounty attached, and language that couched violence and respectability. Dangerous operative among the Apache, incites resistance. Approached by a half-blood scout and an ex-cavalryman for potential leverage. Deliver by evidence or by proof of absence. She looked from the paper to the man who had given her a coat and a choice instead of a command. He watched her with eyes that could be flint or water depending on the light. The twist inside Nia snapped into shape with the finality of a snare. The men at the river had not chosen her by accident. She had been hunted in a manner designed to humiliate and draw her into the open. Her humiliation was a tactic, her anger a corridor, and the coat that had wrapped her against the cold, the coat that had signaled decency, had carried a paper that named her as quarry. She did not reach for her knife. She did not reach for words. She reached for memory, for the careful scaffolding of moments since the river, the turned-away gaze, the offered space, the deference to her choice to ride after thieves or not, the steady presence beside her anger, which neither tried to snuff it nor to feed it. She read the paper again, and saw another line she had skimmed past the first time, a line that bent the path of what she feared. Formally attached to the 7th at Fort Goodnight. Dismissed for insubordination after refusing to carry out order involving Apache hostages, alleged sympathies under review. The ink did not name the cowboy, but the coat did, and the dust sewn into it did, and the refusal did. Nia tucked the paper back where she had found it and stitched the seam with the first thing her hands could find, a needle made from a bone hairpin and thread teased out of the coat's own tired hem. The boy slept. The swallows folded themselves into the edges of dusk. The cowboy's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter as memory. His eyes drifted to the bell tower. Without a word, without a single syllable of any language, the two of them chose the same moment to stand, as if called by a chord sounded only inside their bones. The boy wasn't the only one the thieves had marked. A strip of fabric fluttered from the bell rope. It was not a ribbon or a pennant. It was a shawl Nia recognized too well. Pink as a sunrise after a hard night, the exact shade worn by a woman from her camp who had gone to trade for sugar 2 days earlier and had not returned. Wind made it clap softly against the wood, a cruel applause. Nia climbed the ladder and took it down with the gentleness one reserves for the things the dead have touched. In the rafters lay another note, this one smeared with grease, as if a hand had eaten and threatened in the same motion. The words carried a trail deeper into the desert, toward a mesa so flat it could have been chopped by a blade. Bring the woman who calls herself Nia. Bring her at dusk. Bring the man with the hat if you like. Payment doubled for the pair. The trap had grown a bigger mouth. A town no longer anchored to any law waited out there, run by a man who'd never needed a badge to give orders. He was the kind who laughed while he burned a letter in the house around it. He'd pulled a dozen debts from a dozen counties and braided them into a whip that could crack across the territory. His name was Reddick, and he had the sort of eyes that saw a vein of water in a stone and called in a contract. He'd hired the thieves. He'd placed the bounty. He'd written the taste of vengeance into corners where even the wind couldn't lick it clean. Nia and the cowboy moved like shadow and bone through the remains of the town and found sign where only a tracker would have searched. A spur groove on the floor, a smear of coal on a windowsill, the heel drag of a woman who had walked and refused to fall. The child's breathing smoothed out. Night fixed itself high and sharp. Coyotes tuned their hunger to the same key as the stars. Nia banked the fire until it was a red pulse, like a heart. When sleep came, it was thin and practical. When dreams came, they were thick and mean. In hers, Nia stood at the river again, water to her hips, loneliness up to her throat, while the canyon walls bent closer, as if to see whether she would bend too. The thieves laughed, and their laughter split into the crack of a firing line.
It wasn't the river she stood in, but a patch of floodwater pooled in the street of a town where people cheerfully sold things like rope and mothers. She woke with the taste of iron in her mouth and the bell in the tower answering some old question asked by a different midnight. At dawn, the boy woke and studied them with eyes that had learned to weigh. He accepted a crust of scrap bread and a strip of jerky as wages paid for survival. He touched the shawl and flinched as if it carried heat. He pointed north to where the desert stepped up into a plain that pretended to be empty and then revealed it was a chessboard where pieces had names like cattle baron and railroad trustee and captain with the papers. His boy's finger trembled and then steadied. He mimed a wagon and then a circle of men around it, and then one man walking out of the circle while another fell. He knew the grammar of brutality. He told it without words. They rode with the sun at their backs until heat lay its full hand on them at noon. The trail shredded and then braided itself again because men who were sure of themselves get lazy about secrets. Nia's horse pushed through sage that smelled like old forgiveness. The cowboy's hat brim cut the light into two neat halves, before and after. The boy slept in front of Nia on the saddle for as long as her arms could fence him in. When he woke, he pointed again, and the line of his arm promised not a destination, but a reckoning. A ranch sat where the land took a breath before rising into the mesa. It had once belonged to a family whose graves now leaned behind a wind-shot fence. The house was a page torn from prosperity, still legible in patches. A tall man waited on the porch. His boots were clean at the toes and dirty at the heels, a detail Nia could not help cataloging. Clean toes means he doesn't walk where the work is. Dirty heels means he stands and lets the world come to him. He wore his pistol in the way a man wears his own hand, with ease that makes it dangerous. The man on the porch lifted his hat politely to shade his face. Politeness can be a kind of theft. Nia had learned that, the way she learned to shed a skin when snakes nested too close. The boy stiffened against her and made a sound that was not a word, but contained within it the whole encyclopedia of fear. Nia's horse danced under the weight of that sound. The cowboy pulled up and the air around him tightened. It was the same tightening that arrives one heartbeat before lightning stitches sky to earth. The man on the porch smiled with his mouth, but not with his eyes, which were pale and flat like lake ice in January. Reddick, whispered the dirt. Reddick, whispered the kidneys of the earth. The cowboy's shoulders made a small motion, muscle remembering another field, another commander, another refusal. The porch man flicked his fingers, and men drifted out from behind the edges of the house and the barn and the pump. Rifles moved in their hands the way fish move in water. The wind hung quiet, so it could hear. A woman stepped from the shadow near the pump, her shawl missing, hair braided with ribbons dirt had stolen distinction from. Nia recognized her mouth before she recognized the rest. It was a mouth that thinned when it held back truths for the sake of the young. She stood tall in a way that told Nia the thieves had not removed anything that mattered. The boy lunged for her, and Nia's arm failed at last to be a fence. He ran like a colt released and slammed into her skirt with a sound that was apology and relief and insistence that the world for a moment be exactly what a child needs it to be. The man on the porch swallowed that reunion with his eyes and pulled it down his throat to sour his belly. He would use it later, the way men use small, sweet things to make great, bitter things taste righteous. He gestured again, and the men's rifles lifted just enough to change the day's shape. Nia placed her hand on her thigh where her knife would be if this were a story that renewed itself too quickly with blood. The cowboy kept his seat, as if the saddle were a fact God had written. Reddick spoke, and though no dialogue is needed here, the breeze translated the gist into the language of posture and weapon and shadow. This was an exchange, not a reunion. This was the middle of the script, not the end. This was where choices are picked up like spent shells and examined for fingerprints. He pointed at Nia and the hat that shaded the cowboy's unblinking eyes. He pointed at the boy and the woman. Then he pointed at the horizon as if he owned it.
Nia could smell the lie before it left his teeth. Lies have a solvent smell, like something meant to clean and actually built to strip. She reached into herself for the part that negotiates and found it calm, the way a mountain flood settles into widening water after a gorge. She had learned over years to braid her fury into a rope that could haul a situation where it needed to go. The cowboy shifted his hands on the reins, and the horse beneath him snorted a message to the earth. Somewhere, in the rafters of Nia's chest, the bell from the ghost town swayed once, whispering that salvation and doom ring at the same pitch. Then the twist folded down with the suddenness of a hawk stooping. A second rider drifted out from behind the barn like a rumor that has finally found its proof. He eased his horse forward until the light offered his face to recognition. The cowboy's hat brim did not move, but the muscles of his jaw did. Nia watched the man who had given her a coat and a choice stare at the newcomer and become a person more complicated than she had allowed for. Because the man who slid into the yard wore the same eyes. Not similar, same. Brothers, carved from the same stubborn stone and weathered by different storms. The newcomer carried a badge that had never seen a uniform. It glittered at his chest like a lie pretending to be law. He spoke without words as well. The set of his shoulders said he would sell a brother for a deed to water. The way his fingers flicked the reins said he'd already done it once and would do it again. Nia understood without needing anyone to narrate it that the man had ridden with armies and later with Reddick, had learned the taste of authority and then the taste of profit, and had decided the second was sweeter. The cowboy did not reach for his gun. He reached for a memory that only showed in his eyes. A night lit by a burning barn, a father screaming a son's name, a mother's hands on a boy's head while the older brother reached for a bottle. Two paths, then, sliding away from each other, one into war and refusal, one into purchase and command. And now they had curved back, as paths do in territories that pretend to be endless. A breath moved the yard. It lifted grit. It lifted hope. It lifted the shawl at the woman's shoulder and made it flap once, like a small flag. The boy stayed pressed to her and did not look up. Nia saw the choices arrayed like cards and saw that none were fair. Reddick's men shifted into aim. The angle of their barrels turned shadow into arithmetic. The cowboy's brother smiled without heat. The mesa watched because mesas have patience, and patience likes to see if courage can keep its footing on loose gravel. The boy's hand went to his pocket. Nia's eyes caught the motion, small and ordinary and about to be effused by mistake. He pulled free a tiny shape, a stone carved to look like a dog, a shepherd, its ears worn smooth by worry. He held it as if it could bark the guns back to sleep. Reddick's men laughed with their shoulders, just enough to tilt the air the wrong way. Somewhere, a rattler announced it was tired of being stepped near. Nia took a step because someone had to. The cowboy took one in the same heartbeat. The yard flinched. The brother's hand brushed his gun, lighter than air but heavier than judgment. The woman's breath caught. The boy's stone dog glinted. The sun shifted behind a thin cloud and erased shadow for the fraction of a second needed to make men who live on shadow nervous. And from the far side of the corral, where none of them had looked because humans forget to look where shame points, another figure rose from behind the water trough, hat brim torn, shirt dark with dried river, the lead thief from the canyon, alive despite the night and proud of the fact that he was alive, his grin bitten into his face like a scar knifed in by an unsteady hand. He carried not a rifle, but something worse for a day like this, a fuse already hissing and a stick of dynamite that had once slept in a railroad crate and now dreamed of highways made of air. He lifted the fuse as if the yard were a theater and the curtain had finally gone up. Reddick's eyes flared because even tyrants hate improvisation. The brother swore under his breath in a language only families speak,
The woman pulled the boy into her so swiftly that the shawl's threads sang. The cowboy drew, finally, cleanly, as if practicing in his mind all morning how not to draw until he had to. Naya felt her bones choose a direction, and it was toward the thief and the fuse and the screaming bright math of explosion. The fuse spit and chewed. The horses went mad in their skins. Time became a rubber band pulled until you could hear it think about snapping. The cowboy's shot cracked the idea of quiet into powder, and then someone else's shot stitched a second tear right beside it. The stick of dynamite flew, and then arced in a way a thrown star does when the thrower has more hate than aim. It sailed toward the pump, where the shadow of water had always been a kind of insurance. The brother lunged left, not to save his kin, but to save Reddick's barrels. Reddick moved right, not to save a child, but to save a ledger. The woman turned and wrapped the boy with everything she had. Naya ran, feeling the ground tilt like a plate someone had decided to flip. She heard the cowboy shout with the hold of his body. She saw his hand reach for her with a promise she could not read because the air between them filled with the white roar of a second born too early. The fuse vanished inside the day. The yard inhaled. The stick struck the pump and bit. And then, right as the world leaned forward to learn which pieces would survive the mathematics of fire, the bell in the ghost town rang out across miles of desert without wind to move it, and a ripple ran through the ground beneath their boots as if a train were coming underground, as if the earth itself had decided to carry news. The sound reached Naya's heart and turned it just as the light of the explosion started to write a sentence across the ranch that would have to be finished in blood or in mercy. Everything froze for the width of a heartbeat. The stick began to sputter into its last inch. The cowboy's brother had his pistol leveled at Naya's back. Reddick had turned his head toward the sound of that impossible bell. The boy's hand loosened, and the little stone dog fell, striking the dust with a tiny click that felt like a prophecy taking shape. The stick's flame kissed powder. The pump's source of water in a land obsessed with thirst, lifted like a saint about to be stolen. The shockwave started forward, a hard god with no patience. Naya leaped. The cowboy lunged. The woman cried out the name of someone who wasn't there but would hear it anyway. The brother squeezed, and the world bent, but it did not yet break, because, in the half-second at the lip of ruin, as if called by that old bell from the ghost town and the fiercer bell inside Naya's chest, a rider crested the ridge behind the ranch with a flag bound to his saddle horn, not a flag of any nation, but a threadbare piece of cloth painted with a symbol Naya recognized from stories older than any of their births. 3 concentric circles, water within wire, law older than paper. He stood high in the stirrups and threw something small and bright toward the pump, something that glittered like a promise and turned like a prayer. The bright thing spun. The dynamite glared. The dust breathed. The stone dog lay at the boy's feet, listening. And, before any of them saw which star would claim them, the world chose the cliff, not the landing, and left them all with the breath half in, half out, the moment teetering like a coin about to show either salvation or loss. The yard held cord that would not resolve until the desert allowed it.